Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kirsten Marzi. I'm the manager of education and community engagement programs here at Brattleboro Museum and Arts Center. I want to thank you for joining us tonight for this artist talk with Sachiko Akiyama. The plan is that she'll speak for around 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with all of you. If you're here with us on Zoom, you can ask questions using the Q&A function or the chat. And if you're with us on Facebook, you can use the chat function, and we'll keep an eye on that too. And we'll save time at the end for the questions, but you can ask questions at any time. If you'd like to make a donation to support free public programs like this, you can do so at brattleboromuseum.org/support. And we appreciate anything you're willing to give. And we'd like to thank the Japan Foundation of New York for their support of this exhibit and related programming as well. So Sachiko, if you'd like to join me on screen and turn on your camera and microphone. Sachiko Akiyama creates hand-carved wooden forms and explores personal history and folklore and literature. She's a sculpture professor at the University of New Hampshire, and we're excited to present a sculpture workshop with her cardboard mask making on April 30th. So I encourage anyone who's interested to sign up for that as well. So Sachiko, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for sharing more about your exhibit and your work, and I'll pass it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Kirsten. This is going to take me one moment to shift to the presentation. Let's see. Okay, if I don't hear otherwise, I'm going to assume that you can see my screen. So thank you so much for coming here tonight, and thank you to Mara Williams and Sarah Freeman and also Kirsten Marzi, who you just met, for all of your time and thought that you've put into this exhibition. It's been really fun collaborating with you. Oops. I wasn't sure if everyone here today would have had the chance to see the exhibition in person, so I'm going to start with installation shots from the photographer Aaron Jenkins. This exhibition represents work from a 10-year span, starting from this large relief that I made in 2011. I love that this museum is situated in an old train station and that this original identity remains very present. The multiple trains passing through, coming from, going to different places, is an apt metaphor for my studio practice. My work is influenced by various repetitive pathways. This is where the title of the exhibition, Through Lines, comes from. For this virtual walkthrough, I'm going to focus on these through lines or artistic pathways in my work, such as themes and symbols, formal issues, and artistic influences. I should also say that on the museum website, you can do a virtual walkthrough of the exhibition. This piece titled Gathering depicts myself with my grandfather. He died from leukemia when my mother was a child. The viewer doesn't have to know who these people are in order to understand this piece. I'm hoping that they can gather clues about their relationship through the sculpture. Even though I didn't get to meet him, I feel like I've inherited parts of his personality, and the choices he made have affected aspects of my life. I identified with him when I heard stories about how he hitchhiked across Japan, or how he tried to learn how to navigate using the stars. The strings are a way to visually reflect this connection. I tried various approaches before I reached this solution. At one point, I was experimenting with draping fabric and then strings of beads from the figure's hands. I liked the red string because it could represent bloodlines, but I didn't want this reference to exclude other interpretations. I manipulated or altered the string to imply a repeated gesture or a record of time? My solution was knotting the string at regular intervals. The pile of knotted string can be read as a record of the passage of time or accumulated experiences. I like to choose imagery and symbols that have the potential for multiple interpretations. Once I decided to use the string, I was interested in other references that knotted rope and strings have. In my research, I learned that there are different ancient societies that use knots as a form of communication. The Incans, for example, use quipu, or talking knots, to store and communicate information, such as stories and numbers. The use of quipu dates as far back as 2600 BC. And this was only one of many examples of quipu pictured here. And I encourage you, if you are interested in this image, to look this up, because there are so many different versions of these knots and different configurations. And as you can see, it's both a functional and a beautiful form. I like the idea of the figures in my sculpture knotting the string and contributing stories to a shared history. Formally, the string contrasts with the static wood forms. The linear string implies movement, leading the eye from the figures on the wall to the floor. Oh, another thing I learned too, this was really interesting. I didn't know this. I used to sail a lot, and I learned that knots, the nautical term knots, originated from measuring the speed of the ship using knotted rope, which is another marking of time or speed. These are two examples of my past work that explored family connections. On the left is a half-size portrait of myself with my grandfather. And on the right, on the wall, is a portrait of myself with my parents and my sister. I apologize about the quality of the photo on the right. I actually had to scan an old school slide for this one. Like the seated figures in the Brattleboro exhibition, I'm always thinking about the size and the placement of the figures. I'm interested in how the viewers relate to the sculptures with their own bodies, whether they have to crouch down and look at the small figures on the floor or gaze up at the figures mounted on the wall. And this is something that I love about sculpture, that it is physical. I haven't made a life-size figure for a long time, like the ones in the Decordova shot, since graduate school. I prefer that the experience of looking at my sculpted figures isn't like encountering real people. I want my sculptures to exist in another realm, somewhere between our world and an ethereal world. The chair piece and the figures on the wall in the previous slide were both influenced by my interest in sculptures that are made for religious buildings. I have a particular love for Gothic and medieval art. When I visited the Chartres Cathedral, I fell in love with the sculptures on the outside of the building. I like the stylization of the figures and the symbolic gestures and objects. I'm also interested in how the figures were made to exist in relationship to the architectural elements, like the elongated figures mirroring the form of the columns, or the seated figures fitting into the nooks. I hope that the reference to the Chartres figures are evident in these wall pieces. Instead of architectural elements, I created a place for these figures to exist using the chairs and the shelves, which I built both of them, or all of them. The seated figures have feet that hang below the bottom of the chairs so that they can only exist suspended up high. Another significant influence on my work is my Japanese heritage. My parents immigrated to the US in the late 1960s. Japanese culture permeated every aspect of my life, from food to music to art. I felt like a hybrid between Japanese and American cultures. The image on the right is an example of the vertical composition that is frequently used in Japanese and Chinese paintings. I was trying to create a similar vertical stack space in this relief. The vertical space in these paintings made sense to me when I visited Japan because its land is 80% mountains. So the towns are tucked in between the mountains and you're frequently surrounded by these vertical views. When I was a child, my grandmother, who is still in Japan, sent us a lot of children's books. The image on the right is from a children's story that I grew up with. Cranes are a common symbol in Japan. It is a holy creature that represents longevity and good fortune. In my work, I frequently depict the figure interacting with animals. It takes me a while to adopt an animal into my work. I usually select animals I have had personal experiences with and that have the potential for a variety of interpretations. I wanted to find my own American version of the crane. I used to jog when I lived in Boston. This was a long time ago, and would see a great blue heron that lived along the Emerald Necklace. And for anyone who's seen them, I think you might have a similar experience of thinking that you've seen a ghost when you first see it out of the corner of your eye. They have a very otherworldly and ghostly presence when they stand motionless in the water while they hunt. And when they take flight, they have this enormous, awe-inspiring wingspan, and they almost look prehistoric. And I love this contrast between these two states. The piece on the left is one of my earlier heron pieces. And this one was inspired by, there's a great sculpture by Picasso of a man holding a lamb. Here's some other examples of work I was inspired by when I made the heron relief. I'm always looking at art from the past and also contemporary art. It was really difficult to decide which images to share with you because there are so many. Many of my artistic influences are religious sculptures and paintings. In my work, I'm exploring similar themes, but from a secular point of view. I'm thinking about the universal questions about who we are, and I think that the answers are hidden in nature. I also hope to capture similar solemn and introspective qualities of this kind of work. The fragment pictured here is another example of medieval sculpture. I took this picture when I was in Frankfurt, Germany, and it's an image that I frequently return to. I love the high relief and the focus on the hands and the face. And I also like how the body merges with the forms of the landscape. And then on the left is one of my favorite Egyptian sculptures that's at the Louvre. And Egyptian art is another sculpture tradition that I draw inspiration from. In this piece, the small figure is the only one looking directly at the viewer. I think of her as a type of narrator, like someone in a play addressing the audience. She has the proportions of an adult and is more three-dimensional than the larger figure. The difference in modeling and scale between the two figures signifies that they aren't from the same worlds. The small figure could be an inner voice or a narrator relaying a story, and maybe the larger figure is an ancestor or someone from a dream. And the larger figure is communing with the heron. I don't expect viewers to interpret my work in one way, and I hope that I've embedded enough in the work so that there are many different ways to read the piece. Drawing is one way for me to gain an understanding of my subject matter. I usually don't exhibit my drawings, but I do draw a lot as a part of my studio practice. I don't ever make drawings depicting what an actual sculpture will look like. I think that would take the fun out of sculpting and really trying to discover what something will be. This is an early sketch that I made for that large relief. And the right are sketches I made at a small zoo in Wyoming. I had looked for grizzlies when I was at Yellowstone, but when I couldn't find any, there was a small zoo where badly behaving bears were placed. And I brought my sketchbook and camera there and stayed the whole day and just drew the bears. I took the general compositional ideas from that sketch and moved cutouts of the two figures around the piece when I first started to determine the position of the figures. These are two images of the piece from the show in progress. And you can tell that from the image on the left to the right, there are some changes in the composition. And I decided to add bushes on either side of the composition to create a more intimate space for the figure and the heron. And I also added more layers of wood too, to create more depth. This is a relief that I completed, 2021. And my reliefs have evolved over time. I've been experimenting with making fragments that alternate between modeled form and the flatness of the original block. Like the rear of the figure is very flat versus the face is very modeled. This piece directly preceded the half portrait of the bear in this exhibition. I want the material and process to be evident, like the carving marks. The accumulation of these marks are like the knots in the string, reflecting the passage of time and how this sculpture was made. I also based this piece on the pose from Goya's Sleeper Reason, and I removed the desk. I think of people as being in continuum with nature. These two half portraits merge the figure with animals. I do think of this person in my work as a version of myself. The content is so personal to me that I feel like I have to use myself or my family as a starting point. I'm not interested in depicting a likeness of myself, and I hope that the work can be interpreted through a more universal lens. Similarly, in this piece, the birds become the figure's body. During the first pandemic lockdown, there was a group of catbirds that would visit my lawn every morning, and they haven't returned in the following years. They're called catbirds because their call sounds like a cat. Because of this noise and the large number of them, they were both comical and a little menacing to me. They're also really beautiful. I see this figure as my pandemic portrait, and it is either being overwhelmed or weighted down by these birds, or the birds are taking flight and there's a sense of release. I was recovering from my hand surgery at this time, and I started focusing on exploring the small scale. And I was thinking about Giacometti's small figures that command a small presence, even from a distance. I thought it'd be fun to show you the piece I'm working on now that was inspired by that little piece in the show. I was curious to see how this image would work on a larger scale. And I was thinking about Michelangelo's slaves, which are sometimes referred to as unfinished works because the forms of the figure are carved to different states of completion. Similar to the slaves, I'm rendering some parts more fully and leaving other parts blockier. Many of the birds look like they're straining to pull themselves out of the block of the wood. And so the image on the left is the initial block that I started with. And as I worked, I had to add more material and alter the shape a little bit. Oops, I keep losing my arrow. I'm sorry. Here we go. Here is an example of one of the 4 slaves, Michelangelo's slaves. And you can see that this figure looks like it's pulling itself out of the stone or bearing the weight of the stone. And on the right is another image I was thinking about for this piece. It's a photograph of the great Louise Bourgeois wearing one of her latex sculptures. I'm including process pictures because I find that people are usually interested in this and ask a lot of questions about this part of my practice. I usually work from planks of wood that I glue into blocks. So that's a picture of where I currently go to buy my wood. And this is much more stable than working from a single piece of wood. I mostly use basswood because it's light and easy to carve. And my favorite wood is butternut, which is what the small figure in this exhibition is made from. And what I do is I take the wood and I glue it into what looks like cutting boards, and then glue those cutting boards together to create a block. And that's what you see on the left that's being clamped. And this is more stable because you can alternate the direction of the grain. And then once this is glued together, I use power tools at the beginning, but I use this pretty sparingly and use mostly hand tools because I find that the power tools move faster than I think and can problem solve. In my more recent work, I let portions of the bare wood show and frequently use the wood as skin tone. So here are some examples of works in progress showing how I use paint on the piece. I used to use gesso once I finished carving and then used oil paint. So that large relief in the show has been completely gessoed white, and then I painted it with oil paint. But once it's painted, I can't go back into the form and carve more. I didn't like how the painting was so separate from the carving, so I decided to switch to acrylic. The blue figure with the bird is painted with acrylic paint, and the middle image is in progress when I put the color down, but I'm still carving, so I had to continually re-add the color. And this way I was able to alternate between painting and carving so that the 2 processes were more integrated. This blue sculpture is a portrait of my niece, and this followed the bear relief in the exhibition. And I didn't put a full picture of this, but this was also making me think about those Chartres figures on the column. This piece looks like a plank of wood and almost like a column. This is a shaky stop motion video of a sculpture I just completed. If you focus your attention on the sculpture in the middle, it's easier to follow. And I can play it a couple of times because it goes by pretty quickly. And then one more time. Oops. There we go. One more time. And you can also see how I'm adding paint and then carving it away. And actually, I ended up carving away the paint that's at this stage too. And this is the completed piece. And this sculpture will be a part of my show at Tracy Morgan Gallery in June. And then this was based off of the piece that was in the show. The fox piece relates to the bust in this exhibition. This piece, I was wondering if people might think was the odd man out in the show because it doesn't have a landscape or an animal with it. To me, the figure can be a landscape. And I think of the blue body as the mountain that the head rests atop, similar to that fragment I showed you earlier from Germany. The pedestal is made specifically for this piece. Traditional boxy white pedestals can distance the viewer from the sculpture. The base of this piece is an abstract stand-in for the figure's body. And the idea of the sculpted base is attributed to the sculptor Brancusi, who displayed his sculptures on sculpted bases and would move around his pieces in his studio like a living installation. I might have gone a little quickly with this talk, but this is actually my last image. So I'm going to stop sharing.
That was great. Thank you so much. It was so
You're
interesting.
welcome.
Yeah, it's so interesting to see more about your process and those photos kind of in between at the different stages. That was great. Yeah, and so if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A function or the chat function, and we'll make sure that you answer those. But I was wondering, when I look at your pieces, I really love the textures that you have, and the like chisel marks are like brushstrokes in a painting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
They really show the evidence of the hand. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think about texture.
When I first started carving a long time ago, I started sanding things, and I missed the idea that you could see the process in the final piece. And I like seeing those accumulated marks. And I think it is similar to paintings when you can really physically almost recall the actions of the artist. And increasingly, I'm trying to show more of that process. And that also relates to that image from the piece where I carve and then paint and carve and paint. Because I want all those processes to really be evident in that final piece. And I think it reads very differently from like something that's completely sanded and finished that almost looks like it just came into being rather than something gradually appearing or maybe disappearing. Yeah,
and I think you said about that you can feel the time that it took too, like with each hand motion. I think that's a really great observation.
That's the time of physicality, really.
Yeah, and you feel the presence of the artist in the piece. We have a couple questions. Let's see. Dan asked, could you say more about the decision to use paint and what you see as its function other than emphasizing the figurative details of the pieces?
Yeah, that's a good point, that it definitely does emphasize the different parts of the figure, but I think it also makes these things come alive more. Like, I think like when you watch the video, this thing almost looks more like just a sculpture until it starts getting color, and then somehow it animates it. Color has been such an important part of what I do, and I think it also adds to the mood of the piece too. Like, I can never imagine that big relief in the show without color. I think it like completely sets the tone. Like, I was thinking of nighttime for that piece and something that was very quiet, and it's very different than if it were just bare wood, or if it was a different palette, it would completely change.
Yeah, definitely. And I like that with some of your pieces, you can see the wood grain through and how those colors work together. Yeah. Kathy asks, Tom Seeger and Kathy here too. The last image seen from behind is a beautifully abstract image. Do you see your work move closer or farther from abstraction?
That's a great question. Hi, Kathy and Tim. I hope it's okay, I can just say this. Tim was my first sculpture professor ever. And so it's so lovely to have him here. I am definitely trying to work towards being more abstract, and also trying to show the messiness of the work too, or the studio, like trying not to make everything just look like this very refined, like delicate, untouched piece. I like showing like the block of the wood, and then a lot of times I leave pencil marks too. Like, so on that video that I showed, a lot of times while I'm carving, I map out the piece by by drawing on the piece. And sometimes those marks end up on the final piece, and I used to erase them, but now I'm starting to keep it. And I'm hoping, like, I would love for them to become even more abstract too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of, like, I imagine you kind of having a plan and then doing some work and having that shift and change, and then like all of those changes being incorporated into the final piece. Is that kind of what it's like?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
And then that bear piece, the one where I was able to take a half portrait and merge it with something else.
Mm-hmm.
I think that process also allows me to experiment more and really try to push this abstraction more,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just starting from a block that I can't alter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So being able to merge two pieces or
Exactly.
kind of play around. Yeah. We have some other questions. Carrie asks, where did your interest in carving wood begin?
I was actually going to add that because people do ask that. And I think this is kind of funny, but it started in kindergarten because my teacher had a little unit where she had a little table set up with blocks of wood and a hammer and nails, and we were allowed to make things. And I just remember being obsessed with this. And so I asked my parents for wood tools in kindergarten for Christmas. And
Wow.
I had my little shop in the basement, and I wasn't carving, but I was nailing things together. And then my godfather was a woodworker, and he used to have me come over to his house and we would make projects, more like furniture. But and then in college, I was able to start carving with Tim.
That's amazing. I
Yeah.
can't believe that you found wood as a medium in kindergarten. That's fantastic. Have you talked to that teacher since?
Oh gosh, no, I mean, this was kindergarten. So.
Yeah, I know. It's a long time ago. That's so cool though. What a great, I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know. That's amazing that that teacher did that. I didn't have wood shop in my kindergarten class. That's great.
And I actually made a horse too. I remember that was the
Wow.
first thing I made. So I made an animals. And I think in a lot of ways, there's so many things just embedded in us just
Yeah.
from the very beginning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're exploring the same ideas, same medium. That's great. Jonathan asks, are you still using metals in your work? I remember you incorporating hammered aluminum or tin into one of your portraits from a few years ago. The pressed marks on the metal were interesting next to the carved marks of the wood. He
Oh,
said, great talk.
definitely. Oh, I wonder if Jonathan, my former student. But
Talit?
yeah, Jonathan. Hi,
Yeah.
Jonathan. And yes, I am using the metal. I still have it in my studio. I haven't found a way to use it again in the right way, but definitely that's really perceptive of him to say that I used it in the same way that I use wood. I really like to show the marks. Like, so I took little sheets of metal and little nails and pounded it onto a carved figure. And you could see all the marks of the hammer on the metal. And I really love using different materials. So that's increasingly becoming more part of my work. I've been learning how to become a better welder too. And I just think adding all these different materials really diversifies the expressive potential, or my language, the possibilities. And it's a nice contrast to the wood.
Yeah, definitely. I really appreciate the textile element, the knotting that you used in this piece. And I liked hearing about the history and the etymology of it. That was really neat.
Yeah.
We have other questions. Let's see. Carrie asked, do you draw inspiration from Noguchi?
Oh, I do. Yeah,
Yeah.
Noguchi was a Japanese American sculptor. I'm so bad with my dates, even though I'm a teacher, maybe like the 1950s or 60s. And he had very simplified forms, and he really had a respect for materials and highlighted those materials. And I think I'm influenced by him in that way. And he definitely had a Japanese sensibility to his forms too.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll have to look him up. Kathy asks, the one image you showed of a drawing was so beautiful. Is drawing invisible for you relative to the concreteness of sculpture?
Thank you for saying that about my drawing. I think I get a little self-conscious about drawing. I feel like it's my hidden little activity. I think I'm actually very physical the way that I draw. I have a drawing wall in my studio, and I really like to rub the charcoal on and then rub it off with erasers. And I'm not very delicate with things. So I've been told before, people look at some of my drawings and say, oh, you draw like a sculptor, because I think things look very physical in that way. And then also the things I draw can have so much form to it. I don't know if that really answers the question. It definitely exists in a different, it's different from sculpture. Like, you can't physically interact with it, but I think it definitely has overlap too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And thinking about the depth in a drawing and then the depth in a sculpture. Carrie asked, do you ever incorporate stone into your beautiful sculptures?
Oh, thank you. I tried stone a long time ago. I took a marble carving workshop in my 20s, and there's something very cold about stone to me compared to wood. I just like the warmth of wood. And I think it's because wood is a living material, and also the color of it too. I just couldn't go back. It's the hardness too of stone I couldn't embrace. Although I have been using concrete a little bit, been casting that, which reads like stone a little bit, but I think I don't know why I feel better about using that than carving.
What have you been doing with concrete?
I've been casting these heads.
Cool.
And then painting them. And I've showed them once, but I think I'm gonna take all the paint off and try again. So, but
Interesting.
yeah.
That's such a different it's like a different process instead of like taking away or.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like the casting though, because I don't have just one shot at figuring something out, and I can try many different versions. It's been really
So do you
good.
have a bunch of heads?
I have a lot of heads, and they're so heavy.
Yeah. That's great. I'd love to see your studio full of heads and experiments. Carrie asked, do you have a favorite wood chisel?
I definitely do, and I try not to let myself use them too much, because I think sometimes my marks get too repetitive when I use the same chisels. But yeah, and you can definitely tell in my studio that some of the chisels, like the handles, are much more worn, the ones I use all the time. But
yeah. Let's see. I think Carrie had a follow-up question. Can you speak on what you get from hand carving?
Hand carving. That's such a good question. I was actually thinking about that today, because with hand carving and also carving these figures, it's such an intimate experience. I always feel like I'm like mounting my sculptures or hugging them or crawling underneath them. It's just, and then it takes such a long time too. And it's just mark by mark by mark. It's a very meditative experience, and it's also very interactive. I feel like it's very different from, well, it's different from drawing, because that's just my hand versus my whole body is interacting with it. And I think that's important too, because I like how the person who eventually sees the figure too will relate to it. Like, I think I get an understanding from working with it, like how people will read it physically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That just the closeness and the like being like living around it and with it for such a long period of time gives you a different understanding. Yeah.
It's different from like, I used clay too, and that's just more just my hands.
Right.
So,
You're like a little more removed.
exactly.
Yeah. Deb asked if there are a couple of your newer pieces that are reminiscent of Marisol. The flatness is a shift. Is this, oh, this flatness is a shift?
Yeah. Hi, Deb. Marisol is one of my heroes. She actually recently passed away. She sometimes gets categorized with the pop sculptors, but she was different from them too. And I definitely study her. I feel like she's my teacher. And I worry that sometimes that I might be quoting her too directly, but I am interested in how she could mix materials and shift between drawing and three-dimensional forms. And her work was mostly, I think mostly, if not all, figurative too. But yeah, definitely, she's one of my artist heroes.
Yeah. And so like thinking flatter, that's a new line of work for you.
Well, it's actually been something that I've been trying to do for a really long time, but I think I'm starting to do it in a way that I'm satisfied with, or starting to feel like I'm making progress.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And we just had a couple, oh, here's another question. Carrie asks, would you ever consider casting your beautiful work in bronze?
I have looked into it. I think I've always seen my pieces indoors, and I think a really nice thing about bronze is that it can go outdoors. And there are some really beautiful examples of people using patina on it too to get color. So I don't know if I can afford to do that right now, but I would love to. And then I can get multiples too.
Yeah, are you interested in being outside because of the relationship with nature and the animals?
I think so. Yeah. And I'm curious like just even moving my sculptures, and when I had to move it from my studio to my car and seeing it outside, suddenly they become so small outside when they're in the architecture or in a room. I think it'd be fun to try to understand how they function in that different space.
Different scale.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Carrie said we need more feminine work outdoors.
I agree.
Yeah. So I think if anybody has any last questions, we'll take those. We've had a few really nice comments. Mary Miller on Facebook said, excellent. And Carrie had said, this was wonderful, thank you. So I had some really nice comments. So thank you all so much for your questions and your comments. Oh, let's see, there's one more. Deb says, great talk, Sachi. That's nice.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you all for coming. And please feel free to reach out if you do have other questions later. I love hearing how people interpret things. I'm always surprised, and I learn a lot.
Definitely. And you can, Christy said she loved the talk. So if you're interested, you can come to the museum and see this exhibit in person. I highly recommend it. If you're not able to come to the museum, you can see it on our website. There's a virtual tour. And we're open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 to 4. And Sachiko has she has a workshop coming up, the mask making workshop on April 30th. So if you're interested, please sign up for that. And I'd like to thank again the Japan Foundation of New York for their support of this exhibit and related programming. Thank all of you for coming, and thank you to Sachiko for this wonderful talk and exploration of your work. And so I think those are all the things I wanted to mention. If you have questions, oh yes, if you have questions, we have a little Ask the Artist booklet. in the galleries, so you can write your question there. We'll make sure it gets to Sachiko. You can also email us at info@brattleboromuseum.org, and we'll make sure the question gets to Sachiko. So thank you so much, and it was wonderful to be here with you tonight, and hope to see you at the museum soon.
Great,
Take care.
thank you. Thanks,
Bye.
Kirsten.